right. Well, thank you so much for being here. My name is Dylan McDowell. I am the Executive Director at NCEL, and we are grateful for you joining us for this post-election briefing. Um, Small housekeeping item is that we encourage everyone, if you're going to use the chat, make sure to change the who you're sending it to be to everybody instead of just host and panelists. That way you can share that you're here and talk to one another. And also encourage you to use the Q&A functions as we will have time for Q&A toward the end of this time, and I want to make sure we get those questions recorded throughout. So our goal today is to provide an overview of how the election might impact environmental progress and where there are opportunities and challenges ahead at the state level. Let's go to the next slide here and get started. So about NCEL, I know many of you are familiar with us, but we were formed more than 25 years ago by a bipartisan group of state legislators looking to better coordinate shared learning and action on environmental work. That mission endures, and that need for cross-state collaboration has never been more important. So today we have a network of over 1,400 state legislators from all 50 states, and we really focus on being a connector for lawmakers so they can learn from one another and participate in joint actions across state and party lines. Next slide, please. Our program work is divided up into four main categories, and you're going to hear from each program today. So we have climate and energy, conservation, environmental health, oceans, and then environmental justice is woven into all of those topics. I'm really excited that we have our incredible program managers here that are going to talk about programmatic work. But first, we want to start with some high-level points here and hear from some lawmakers. So it's safe to say that state and local action has been and will continue to be where the most substantial climate and environmental progress is made. Simply put, that is where we are seeing the momentum, and we are excited to see that continue. But this summer, we asked some of our legislators in our network at our forum to talk to us about why states matter, and we wanted to start by having you hear directly from them. So we'll take just a moment to hear a short video.
I think state action is what leads the way, and that has always been true in American history. If you think back to the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act, those started as local and state policies that then had critical mass across the 50 states, and then Washington finally acted.
A lot of individuals that I've talked to on the federal level say they look to policies that have been implemented in cities and counties and states because those are going to be the most cutting edge, the most innovative, the most impactful to the people that are being affected the most. So they're closest to the solution because they're closest to the problem.
So many things we think about in our society, we think about what's the White House doing, what's Congress doing, and that's important. But when the rubber hits the road, states are involved, whether it's environmental policy or any number of things. If you want to see real change, there's something happening at the state level.
You know, the states are much more nimble. They are also now the most empowered to be able to make change at the local level. And so, you know, that's what drove me to being in the state legislature in the first place. Like, there's an opportunity at the state level to really make important change on environmental topics.
One thing that happens at the state level that I think is really important is we have the opportunity to empower local citizens to be effective advocates for these policies and to also hold their government accountable. It's a lot harder to do that at the federal level.
States are so important because right now there's so much uncertainty on the federal level with the recent Supreme Court decisions, with the potential for administration changes. You want to create something that really connects with the people of your state. And so states and localities are really where all of the great change that we are trying to achieve comes from.
I think we're at a point in U.S. history where the politics and division in D.C. basically paralyzes, I think, federal action in a lot of ways. And so real change is going to happen naturally at the state level, and making sure we have those conversations and have those policies in place from coast to coast and beyond is just so important these days if we're going to be successful as a country and certainly in our own communities for achieving the things that we really want.
Thank you to all the incredible legislators in our network. I know for me, when I hear stories like that and we talk to folks in our network across the country, those are the compelling pieces that really keep me going and make me excited about this work. And I know we have many partners on this call and folks that have worked directly with these leaders in the states. And so just a note of gratitude to all of the lawmakers that are serving and continuing to move this work forward, and for all of you that are doing that work as well. So now we're going to go through some basics and some of the election outcomes, some of the kind of raw data in terms of changes, and then we're going to start talking about some of the policy implications of those changes. So looking at state control post-election, there are now what state trifectas, which is when one party controls the House, Senate, and the governor's office. You have Republican trifectas in 22 states and Democratic trifectas in 15, and then split legislatures or split government in 11 states. Next slide, please. Some notable trends in terms of how balance of power shifted in different states. Republicans broke trifectas in Michigan and Minnesota. Minnesota is currently tied in the House. Republicans gained a supermajority in the South Carolina Senate and broke a Democrat supermajority in the Vermont House. Democrats, meanwhile, broke a Republican supermajority in North Carolina and the Wisconsin Senate. Democrats gained a supermajority in the Oregon Senate, but fell 2 seats short of being able to meet a quorum and prevent a walkout. Many of you know I'm based in Salem, Oregon, where this has been a big topic of conversation. New Mexico will have its first ever female majority legislature, with women holding 60 of 112 seats. This is the largest female legislative majority in U.S. history. So a huge moment to celebrate and something that we definitely want to lift up, as well as the fact that there were about 170 Indigenous candidates on the ballot across 25 states for all levels of public office. This is a huge increase. There's been an increase of about 300% over the last 20 years of Indigenous candidates. So another really important point in terms of who's making these decisions and moving into state office. Next slide, please. As we look at the impacts of these policies and think about what is going to happen in the future, it is safe to say that the eyes of the world are literally on state governments right now. When we think about the US withdrawing from the Paris Agreement and related climate commitments, it was state and local governments that rose up to fill that gap and ensure those commitments remain strong. We also saw this with states taking actions like renewable energy portfolio standard goals. That increased from 2016. There are now 24 states in DC that have 100% RPS goals, so almost half of the country. While the US is not officially a participant in the recent Biodiversity Conference of Parties that took place in Colombia, there was a strong delegation of what's called subnational governments, so state and local officials. You had state legislators, you had state executive branch officials, we had organizations, all showing up to share best practices and lessons learned to bring back to the US and kind of inform international leadership. We expect that to continue at the climate COP happening, as well as future other international convenings as well. And the message is clear that regardless of what happens at the federal level, states remain committed to this environmental progress and action, and that will be a talking point that will continue through continued state leadership, shared learning, and regional action as well. The election is, so there's kind of 3 categories we want to talk about, because the election is likely to bring sweeping changes to the federal government. There's going to be rollbacks, shifts in priorities, all of these things that can impact the work underway. We witnessed many of these during the 2016 election and the aftermath of that. But states are arguably in an even better position to continue progress due to the foundations of policies that have been enacted over the last 8 years. So there's 3 categories that we've been building out as kind of a way to understand state action moving forward. And these will come up in the comments that the program teams will talk about in a moment. First is that states can inspire federal action. So we've seen this with a wide range of issues in the past decade. This includes things like wildlife corridors and connectivity, plastic pollutions, and something called microbeads, which are exfoliants and personal care products that can pollute waterways. Beginning in 2013, there was 25 states that passed or introduced legislation prompting Congress to take action. And Congress ended up passing what's called the Microbead-Free Waters Act to direct cosmetic and soap companies to phase out production of microbeads in 2017. This is a direct result of states working together, eventually shifting the federal government policies. Number 2 is that states can fill the gaps left by federal rollbacks or inaction. Two examples. One is that the federal government has made efforts to ban wildlife trafficking, but states have a very important role to play, ensure there's strong prohibitions within their borders to make sure they build on that control. And in 2017, Vermont enacted an appliance efficiency standard that built on and codified the existing federal standards to safeguard against rollbacks. This was a really important step where the state was able to say, we're setting our own standards, we're taking the federal standards, making them a floor, not a ceiling. And then this inspired at least 4 other states to take action. And then category number 3 is that states can push back. An example I'll mention is that when the federal government announced a plan to increase offshore oil and gas exploration and drilling, states united to protect their coastlines. In 2018, there was more than 225 state legislators signing a letter opposing the threat to coastal states' environment and economies from this action. Since that letter, there have been 10 states that have taken action through legislation or amendments to restrict offshore drilling and its enabling infrastructure. These are just a few of the many, many ways that states are really poised to continue leadership and to make progress that will both inform and react to federal decisions. Now we're going to have NCEL staff walk through some areas we expect to see continued momentum, new initiatives, or state pushback against efforts that threaten environmental progress. To start us off, I'm going to turn it over to Ava Gallo, who's our Climate and Energy Manager.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. So to kick us off, I think really focusing on the federal-state relationship, we know that the Inflation Reduction Act is at risk. But what we have seen is that the benefits of the program have been proven to be popular across the political spectrum and will be hard to repeal. And so a couple of facts there, almost 4 times of the funding coming from the IRA have gone to Republican House districts when compared to Democratic House districts, which resulted in 18 Republican Congress members writing a letter to Speaker Johnson to protect the tax credits in the IRA. So there's definitely some mixed views on the IRA and wide support across the benefits that have reached communities, particularly with the tax credit programs and new projects that have sprung up in communities across the country. So I think that's going to be a really challenging political maneuver, and some mechanisms in the IRA should be protected with that popularity. And then on the other side, I'll say preparing for federal rollbacks, there's a lot that the Biden administration can still do before the inauguration in January, and to help mobilize states to be able to take the action that they need to be able to when the Trump administration takes power. So I think 2 areas of focus there is finalizing the waiver for California clean car regulations, which several states have already adopted or are in the process of adopting. So that's Clean Cars 2, Advanced Clean Fleets, and Advanced Clean Trucks. So preserving that opportunity for the states to go above the federal government regulations. And then also working with New York State to unpause and implement congestion pricing, which has been paused since June of this year and requires the federal approval to get across the finish line. So those are 2 really key measures that should be a focus over the next couple of weeks. And then looking to what states can do on the positive side, that there's sort of 2 buckets that I see here. States need to focus on getting clean energy in the ground and where it is needed. And so we've heard a lot about bipartisan permitting reform in Congress. I think that has the likelihood of that happening has dropped significantly. So I think that states have the ability to do a lot within their own jurisdictions. And we've seen states like Washington, states like New York really take steps to ease the bureaucratic obstacles in the way of advancing clean energy as fast as possible. And I think on the other side of that, you see transmission. Again, what the federal government is going to do on transmission is tenuous, and states have a lot of ability to regulate that on their level as well, through grid enhancing technologies, through transmission authorities, and other levers that they can pull within their own authority and their public utility commissions. And then I'll say that incentives for renewable energy, I think that solar and wind continue to be popular, but it's those emerging technologies that focus on counterbalancing the intermittency of renewable energy like solar and wind, like geothermal, like battery storage and microgrids that help both reliability and resiliency in the face of disasters that we've seen across the country. So those are newer to the market and have unclear regulatory structures. And so states will really have a role in ensuring that those type of technologies prosper in their communities over the next few years. And then the last piece that states are really going to have to think about is they're being asked to do more work with less funding and less support from the federal government. So where is that funding going to come from? States have already been looking into cap and invest. We've seen in Washington state overwhelming support for their cap and invest program through a ballot initiative. And the idea that voters and constituents are supportive of climate policies when they can see the benefits that affect their communities. So I think that other states should be emboldened to look at the success of cap and invest in Washington state as a funding mechanism. New York is in process of going through the regulatory system to approve their cap and invest program. Other states should follow, looking at green banks and new tax credits, like in Colorado, have created complementary tax credits to the IRA, which will exist in any case of what might happen with the IRA. So those are a couple of top level points, but I will stop it there and pass it over to my colleague, Kate Burgess, who is the Conservation Program Manager. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ava. Appreciate it. And thanks all for being here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about conservation policies. And I'll just start by saying that the biodiversity crisis or the extinction crisis has long trailed behind climate change's shadow, but the impacts of land and water loss and species extinction are just as urgent and wide-reaching. And so that is my pitch today to all of you, that all of you can be conservation champions and that it only emboldens and co-benefits climate, environmental health, and oceans action. Conservation is a tool for hazard mitigation, environmental justice, climate resilience, public health, job creation, and so much more. And state lawmakers have been building really strong momentum around conservation solutions. And we need that to continue now more than ever before. So I'm going to talk about 3 of the top policy issue areas of many more that we have seen and expect continued momentum. So first is wetlands. Protecting wetlands is one of the most effective ways that states can build resilience against climate impacts like flooding, while also safeguarding basic needs like clean water and species habitat. I mean, look no further than Asheville, Vermont, California as recent examples where threats to life, longevity, economy abound. In the continental US, we have lost over 50% of the historical 220 million acres of wetlands, and we are left with about 6% of our land area as wetlands right now. And in 2023, the Saka versus EPA Supreme Court case significantly weakened the Clean Water Act and left states to play defense when it comes to protecting these ecosystems. And so there have been some states that have already passed replicable models for ensuring durable wetlands protection, some with bipartisan support. And there's also a large amount of federal funding that remains to advance these protections. So with these Clean Water Act rollbacks that we continue to anticipate, states are really well positioned to codify the safeguards to fill in the federal policy gaps. And so some states have been pursuing legislation that prioritizes pre-disaster flood resilience grant programs or funding that allows local governments to restore hydrology in flood-prone areas. Wisconsin is an example of that from this year. Other states have been increasing wetlands classifications to expand private landowner incentives for wetland preservations, especially given the uncertainty around the Farm Bill this year and the Wetlands Preserve Program. Some states have lost over 90% of their wetland acreage so far, and 60% of the entire country is in private land. So there's a huge opportunity there for states to support that work. And then lastly, there's a lot of funding available federally through the STORM Act, which is the Safeguarding Tomorrow Revolving Loan Fund program, which can fund state-led conservation and have lots of co-benefits that mitigate the impacts of other natural disasters beyond just flooding. And so far, only 7 states have introduced or passed authorizing legislation that allows states to be eligible for that federal funding. So there's a huge opportunity there. Moving on to biodiversity conservation, I think the highest level stat you've probably already heard is that 1 million species are threatened with extinction, which is a lot of species and a lot of threat to our longevity. And so we anticipate further rollbacks of federal legislation that protects those species, like the federal ESA, the discontinuation of the America the Beautiful Initiative, the Antiquities Act, loss of momentum for Recovering America's Wildlife Act, and a national biodiversity strategy, and so on. And for biodiversity, because the threats are multifold, so too are the solutions. And so some of the tactics that have been and can continue to be successful include strengthening state endangered species acts that complement federal protections. Maryland passed a bill this year that did that. Returning land to tribal nations that carries many benefits, not only for tribes' ability to self-determine their own management of species, but also because we know that biodiversity has been shown to improve when tribes are able to practice traditional and contemporary ecological management techniques. Restricting pesticides, strengthening wildlife agencies to represent all wildlife and all people are other examples of state policy options that have been really successful and can continue to be. Lastly is outdoor engagement. We know that this is a bipartisan issue. We know that accessing safe outdoor spaces is a vehicle for improving health, education, justice, state economies. And we know that states are leading the way on piloting innovative and widely successful bipartisan outdoor programs that strengthen communities and create jobs. We also know that the Great American Outdoors Act was passed under the first Trump presidency, which created the enduring land and water conservation funding. And so while that program is not perfect, we also have seen as a kind of impact of that outdoors can be a bipartisan solution. And so there are tons of policy options that states have pursued to recognize outdoors as a vehicle for all those benefits I mentioned, including passing outdoor and green space equity programs, protecting bike lanes, requiring outdoor education in state curricula, developing outdoor workforces, and establishing state outdoor recreation offices. There's really no shortage of options. And so to leave you, I know I just mentioned a ton of different opportunities, and we often refer to conservation, especially around biodiversity, as like a kitchen sink issue because there are so many different threats and there are so many different solutions. But I will remain steadfast in my pitch that anyone can be a conservation champion, and there are often so many co-benefits that accompany strong and durable conservation policies. So appreciate you all being here, and I will pass that over to Alyssa to talk about some oceans protections.
Thank you, Kate. Very inspiring. My name is Alyssa Weinman, and I'm the Ocean Program Manager here at NCEL, based in New Orleans. And three key areas where we're going to see a lot of attention paid and opportunity are within the offshore energy, coastal and climate resiliency, and blue economy space. So first, to tackle offshore energy, President Trump has promised to stop offshore wind projects on day one of his term. In practice, it will be really difficult for the administration to end existing offshore wind projects like the Block Island Wind Farm off Rhode Island or the South Fork Wind Farm off of Long Island. Instead, what we anticipate seeing are that tax credits for offshore wind under the IRA will be reduced or eliminated, and that executive orders further prohibiting offshore wind leases or the rescinding of already approved leases will likely occur. Conversely, we anticipate that the incoming administration will expand offshore drilling and exploration, much like they did in the previous term. So what can states do about this? The answer is a lot. Opportunities exist to prioritize the onshore infrastructure work necessary to prepare for future offshore wind leases. This is something that the community has talked about for quite a while, and I know our states are excited about. Things like redesigning port areas for future offshore wind staging, or focusing on, where are these products being created in the first place, and how can we really clean up that process of getting them to the ports. Other things we can focus on, like Ava mentioned, is focusing on onshore transmission and the electrical grid to support offshore wind power generation in the future to ensure that these projects are really viable and help states hit their goals. During the previous Trump administration, like Dylan mentioned, 10 states also enacted these offshore drilling bans, and over 220 state legislators collaborated to oppose these expansions. There'll be similar opportunities to take action next term, as well as opportunities for states to really lead the charge on an underpaid attention to concept, which is decommissioning old polluting offshore drilling infrastructure in state waters. Next, talking about coastal resiliency, roughly 40% of the US population lives in coastal counties. And these counties produce 10 trillion in goods and services annually and employ over 50 million people. These coastal communities, as we know, are also under threat due to intensifying storms, coastal erosion, and sea level rise. And Addressing these threats through coastal and climate resiliency legislation is a priority for all of our coastal states, regardless of party affiliation. So, a recurring theme is that states can take advantage of existing federal funds for coastal resiliency projects through remaining bipartisan infrastructure law and IRA funds. And existing funds expended for projects that promote resiliency planning and restoration, coastline restoration, flood mitigation, and nature-based solutions can all qualify for this funding. States can also explore innovative financing options for coastal resiliency efforts. So, for example, back in 2022, California Senate Bill 852 established these climate resiliency districts to raise revenue via tax increment funding, voter-approved property taxes, or fee supplements to finance projects that address climate risks. So we can see projects like this emulated across our states. Also, last week, voters in Louisiana overwhelmingly approved 73%, a constitutional amendment to allow the state to receive royalties from renewable offshore power generation and transfer those funds into an existing coastal protection and restoration fund. So we can see projects like this also take shape. State legislators really can work together with their gubernatorial administrations and regionally across states to fully realize these projects in the coming years. And then paying attention to the blue economy, this is an area where we could likely see convergence across party lines and collaboration between subnational and the federal governments around a sustainable blue economy. So this looks like, services and sectors that are dependent on the ocean, like coastal waters, like ocean tech and research, fishing, tourism and recreation, shipbuilding, renewable energy generation. President Trump has expressed in the past support for the blue economy, particularly around advancing knowledge of unexplored oceans and coastlines and supporting maritime commerce. The need for increased mapping and data collection related to our ocean is a call that's been amplified by academics, nonprofits, aquaria, and community partners alike. And we have a real opportunity to collaborate in support of sustained funding for existing mapping and data collection projects, as well as the protection of critical ocean resources. States can also form their own offices of the blue economy, like Maine and Florida did, which involve bringing diverse stakeholders together to develop and expand strategies to ensure coastal and ocean resilience. States can also look at legislation that supports the growth of the blue workforce of tomorrow and invest in that today. Apprenticeship programs for future offshore wind workers, training programs for workers to decommission old oil and gas platforms, and supporting tribal-led aquaculture and mariculture training programs like those we've seen in Cordova, Alaska. So these are all just, a taste of some of the options available to our states, and we look forward to working with you all on these. And with that, I'll pass it back to Dylan to discuss our environmental health outlook.
Thank you, Alyssa. So I am going to be filling in for our environmental health manager, Navjot, who is currently out of the office. But Navjot is someone to follow up on, but I can quickly touch on some of these categories. So 3 big themes. One is PFAS, also known as forever chemicals, and toxic chemicals broadly, plastic pollution, and sustainable agriculture. Within the PFAS and toxics, we found this to be a very bipartisan issue in terms of the policies being proposed and passed in different states. And they've really led on strong PFAS regulations. There's been federal action as well. And we expect a lot of that to continue. There's also going to be a very strong effort to make sure states pick up the mantle of toxic chemical regulations that maybe won't happen federally. So there's the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, and that process of reviewing and prioritizing chemicals will likely slow down. And so there's a very strong need for states to really pick up that mantle and make sure they have their own state regulations put in place. Under plastic pollution, it's important to note the link that an increase in oil and gas drilling and expansion will actually increase plastic production. There is a direct link of how plastics are made, and this will likely increase single-use plastics. That tie means that there's also a need to deal with the waste. And so something we've been working on a lot is looking at zero waste policies across the country. We're likely to see more efforts around extended producer responsibility, with several states now have put into place, and also thinking about waste management. There's conversations around false solutions like chemical recycling and other ways that states can address these in the most effective manner. Most importantly, with plastic production and all these expansions, is ensuring community input and engagement is a key part of that. And with sustainable agriculture, one of the biggest opportunities ahead is around engagement with the Farm Bill renewal. The Farm Bill reauthorization is currently being discussed, and there's been a large effort on healthy soils and young and beginning farmer engagement. We've seen these efforts at the state level. States like Illinois have tied in healthy soils policies to their funding. States like Minnesota have new and young beginning farmer tax credits. And so we expect those conversations to continue in existing bills like the Farm Bill reauthorization. With that, I've given you kind of a very quick overview of a lot of different policies that are in kind of focus areas that we expect to watch over the next year. We want to move into a Q&A, and I have a couple to kick us off, but I would love for folks to kind of, as you're thinking about all this information, thinking about these areas, perhaps it's topics you work on, feel free to use the Q&A to ask additional questions. Are there policy areas that you're curious about? Are there examples from states where we've already seen this leadership that we can lift up and highlight and use as a model? While we're getting those, we've mentioned a couple times some of the work on state and tribal partnerships and relationships that's come up throughout our work. And we have a learning series on State Tribal 101 that we do with Native Americans in philanthropy. We have one coming up very soon, and so my team will put the link in the chat there. But Kate, I was hoping you could talk just a little bit more about how that'll be even more important after the election results for states to work more closely with tribes.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dylan. I'll also say that we're going to be releasing a toolkit in conjunction with Native Americans in Philanthropy in a couple of months to lay out some of the policy options that can strengthen these relations. But to kind of underscore what you were just saying, Dylan, I think states have a responsibility to elevating tribal governments in their states. States serve all constituents, tribal and non-tribal alike. And so there's a lot that states can do to improve relationships and to elevate tribes' ability to self-govern and self-determine. So a couple that I will call out and pass back to you, some around just laying the groundwork. And so making sure that there is the kind of governance infrastructure to have good state and tribal relations. And so New Mexico, for example, is one of 3 states, I believe Washington and Oregon are the other ones that have a cabinet secretary for their Indian Affairs Department. And New Mexico also passed a bill that requires cabinet level agencies to develop policies that promote state and tribal communication, cooperation, and ensures that each executive agency permanently designates a tribal liaison, which is really core when it comes to passing policies that are tribally led and support tribal priorities and having that kind of capacity and infrastructure within the government. And then I'll name one more and then pass it back, is that there's a lot that states can do to repent before they repair. And so I know that there's been a lot of hateful and harmful rhetoric in the past few years and beyond about tribes in our country. And California was one state that in 2019 issued a formal apology. And I know that this just happened with President Biden, largely on a federal standpoint. But in 2019, California issued an apology via executive order for the state's infliction of violence, mistreatment, and neglect on California's tribes. And so they also pursued the development of a Truth and Healing Council, which aims to kind of clarify the historical record between tribes and the state in order to move forward in the relationship between states and tribes before pursuing policies like land back or ocean back, or ones that are kind of rooted in more environmental topics. And so those are just a few examples that I think are going to be really underscoring the importance of future conservation, climate, oceans, environmental health policies, is making sure that there's that groundwork of good state and tribal relations. And there's lots of examples of how states can work with tribes in their state to make sure that they have that integrity and infrastructure established.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kate. I appreciate those specific examples as well. And I think one thing we found and heard from legislators over and over again is just the desire to learn more and the recognition that there's a need for knowledge and understanding there. And so that's where our learning series is a goal, but also finding some of these specific examples. We have another question here. How will the federal supremacy clause, which says federal laws supersede state laws, impact state laws that are passed by legislatures and the voters in state constitutions? I'll just start and I'll pass it off to anyone else. This is a really good question, and I think some of these legal intricacies are something that folks are really looking into right now as and a whole host of issues, not just environmental ones. But I think in many cases, there has been some really creative ways where states can find gaps that are not explicitly mentioned by the federal government. For example, I mentioned appliance efficiency standards earlier with the example with Vermont in 2017. In that case, there are appliance efficiencies or federal efficiency standards, but there's a host of products basically they don't carry or they don't cover. And so that leaves the opportunities for states to step in and make additional rules and regulations on things not explicitly covered or preempted preempted by the federal government. So that's one example that we're watching. Ava, I'd love if you have anything else you want to share on that, especially as it pertains to climate.
Yeah, I'll add, like I mentioned earlier, California has the waiver to have more strict regulations than the federal government on for the Clean Air Act for automotive emissions because Congress has explicitly regulated around automotive emissions through the Clean Air Act. But in areas that Congress hasn't officially legislated on, states have the ability to act as they see fit. So that's a lot of climate and greenhouse gas emissions are all sort of within that domain. States have the right to protect the health and safety of their citizens. And so that gives the states a lot of leeway, I guess, to legislate around a lot of these different issues. So for climate, at least, I think states are in a pretty good situation, but I'm not sure, Kate or Alyssa, if you have differing views for your subject areas. Cool.
It's a great question and one we want to continue to look at. I do see there's a question about do we have thoughts around the EPA administrator pick that's been announced and how that might impact the influence of state work. I would say that this is a brand new pick and that we as an organization don't have a specific stance or thought on that yet. I would say that just our continued focus is looking at best practices from states and how that can help inform federal work.
I can add just
Let's move on to the next one here, Ava, of are there examples or efforts of states working together on a regional basis for environmental issues? And we have a lot of those. So let's dive into some of those. I guess, Ava, do you want to start with some climate ones? There's lots of good examples I know around grid and transportation and more.
Yeah, sure. So I think around transmission, particularly and with the grid in areas that don't have regional transmission operators, like largely the West and the Southeast, have thought a lot about how to work together, especially with Order 1920 coming out of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So there's a lot of thinking about how states can work together there. And I think also in New England, there's a lot of thinking around transportation emissions, and all those states are really close together. So it's important for those regions to think together, all those states to think together as a region. But I'll pass to Alyssa because I know that there's a lot around offshore wind that I think could be helpful to highlight here.
Yeah, there is a lot around offshore wind. I did actually want to draw attention, though, to just related to the IRA, an exciting project. I can drop a link coming out of North Carolina. It's called the Atlantic Conservation Coalition, which is a partnership between North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland, focusing on restoring over 200,000 acres of coastal habitats, forest, and farmland. These states got $421 million to enact this partnership, which will focus on restoring coastal wetlands, salt marshes, building living shorelines, providing cost assistance to small forest landowners, urban tree planting, and reforestation. And I think it's a really good example, too, of what my colleagues have all emphasized, which is the co-benefits associated with all of these works and projects. So I think that while we can get some of this funding, we can see projects like this realized, as well as partner together on, like Ava mentioned, projects like offshore wind. But I'll drop that link in here.
Those are all fantastic examples. Another question is similar to PFAS. What is the opinion of your team on how the Trump administration and EPA will act on lead in drinking water, such as rolling back lead pipe replacement mandates, lead and copper rule improvements? What may you recommend for state actions to be in response? I think this is a really interesting one where states can really augment or build on federal programs. So the bipartisan infrastructure law, for example, had a lot of money around lead service replacement. And so some states already have funding in place, and there's efforts to continue to augment that and build on it. And I think that this is just an area where we will continue to see states trying to look at financing opportunities to fill those gaps. But hopefully I think it's likely that we'll see a lot of momentum has already started. And so should probably be continued conversations about additional lead service line replacement and making that a priority. Let's go to another question. How do you see conservation playing out in red states going forward? Many of the governments in these states were previously opposed to America the Beautiful and 30 by 30 efforts. I'm curious if you see this getting worse or staying the same. Kate, I'll turn this one to you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Ella. I will also say that I think it was the National Conference of State Legislatures put out a separate analysis, and they remarked that this was a modest change of composition in state legislatures. And so, in answering your question, I think I feel more versed to anticipate some business as usual when it comes to conservation, especially in red states. States that have, introduced anti 30 by 30 resolutions or have not, adopted anything close to the America the Beautiful for All or America the Beautiful initiative by name. I will say that there are a lot of red states that have enacted and funded policies that I believe would fall under the 30 by 30 or America the Beautiful kind of kitchen sink bucket that I talked about earlier. For example, Florida has been appropriating millions and millions to the tune of billions of dollars to protect critical linkages within the Florida wildlife corridor. So protecting fragmented habitat under the guise, one, of species protection, but also for reducing wildlife vehicle collisions, which is a huge threat to public safety. Utah has also appropriated $20 million to leverage federal funding for wildlife crossings. Wyoming has tapped an existing permanent trust fund to annually support habitat connectivity projects. States like South Dakota have passed resolutions in support of grasslands, which is a hugely important ecosystem for lots of critically threatened species that received a lot of really vast, broad, and diverse support. And so those are just a few examples of how conservation is moving forward in red states. And maybe the kind of trite talking point I will use, but I think a durable one is that conservation is going by many different names in states. And so in some states, habitat connectivity looks like promoting public safety through reducing wildlife vehicle collisions. Or in Vermont, they just passed a large flood kind of resilience package because of the massive flooding in Montpelier and across the state, but also had some really critical pieces for wetlands conservation. And so I'll say moving forward, I anticipate, to your point, some of that staying the same using different messaging standpoints, but I do believe and have hope in the ability to pass conservation measures, even in states that folks might think are unlikely. So hope that helped.
That was fantastic. Our next question is, will states be wary of investing in ports, transmission, et cetera, if there's a federal moratorium on offshore wind leases? Could it force states to rethink offshore wind's role in meeting their clean energy target? Alyssa, I'm going to turn this one over to you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Alex. And I think something that states are starting to really contend with at this moment in time. I think, though, it's a question that, given just the length of time that offshore wind leases take, be it for the lease process itself and permitting, a question that states have already been asking themselves. So I think that in the next 4 years, we can anticipate states looking at alternative renewable energy sources to meet some of these goals, but I don't think that will prohibit them in investing in port and transmission infrastructure. This is work that has been delayed and that states haven't had the time and capacity to do a lot of the times. And if there are projects on the ground and groups who are focused on these topics, they're going to be able to lend their energy and support states in the same way that we are. I think there's also increased movements in cleaning up our ports, be it decarbonizing our ports, supporting, development restrictions to ensure that industries that are related to the blue economy are able to afford to remain on ports. So I think we're going to see a lot of attention to ports, and there's some great groups doing work there, and a lot of investment on port projects. But Ava, is there anything you want to add from the transmission side of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that transmission is important for a lot of different reasons, and we've seen a bipartisan group of folks focus on the benefits and the need for transmission expansion, whether that be for reliability, affordability. Transmission lines are energy neutral. So I think that expanding them for just broad reasons will continue to be popular. I know that the Northeast states are where a lot of offshore wind may or may not be occurring, but there also are a lot of lines to connect transmission from hydropower from Canada down into New York State and some other projects connecting different energy sources. So I expect that transmission will still be on the docket either way, but certainly we'll see a little bit with offshore wind.
Really good answers, as always. Next question here is, are there good examples, highlights of pro-environment ballot initiatives, etc., that passed in states during the election? And so we quickly mentioned, or the team quickly mentioned, that Washington upheld the Climate Commitment Act this year with Initiative 2117. There was also the Louisiana Outer Continental Shelf Revenues for Coastal Protection and Restoration Fund amendment that passed. We will have these in our election report is going to be something that we'll send out to everyone afterwards, and it has a quick rundown of those. But I can highlight a few others, but I want to turn it over to the team as well if there's certain ones you want to highlight, and then I can give a quick update on a few other funding mechanisms. But Kate, Ava, or Alyssa, any others that you'd like to highlight, or if you wanted to add any detail to what you've shared already?
I can just add, just to give an example, in a redder state, in South Dakota, they failed their referred Law 21, which is about for regulating carbon dioxide pipelines, which dealt a pretty big blow to the carbon dioxide pipeline going through the state of South Dakota. So I think you see that these type of things continue to be unpopular from different perspectives. I think that a lot of the perspective around this referendum failing was around landowner rights and the disruption of private land. So I think can come from different ways, but this is an exciting ballot initiative that happened in a redder state. Just highlight.
Fantastic. And I'll just name a couple others. California Proposition 4 passed, which authorizes $10 billion to fund various activities aimed at conserving natural resources. Maine authorized $30 million in general obligation bonds for maintenance of outdoor trails. There's Minnesota Amendment 1 extends the dedication of lottery-derived revenue for Environment and Natural Resource Fund. Rhode Island issued $53 million in bonds for environmental-related products. And there's a few others that we'll have in the analysis as well. But quite a bit of money went to these efforts in terms of environment, natural resource funds at the state level through ballot initiatives. Looks like I accidentally skipped over a question here. So we have a question that you mentioned that previously that states can ban offshore drilling, but simultaneously the federal government can stop wind farms. Can you explain more about the rules for what federal government versus state controls when it comes to coastal waters? The short answer is this continues to be an incredibly complex question due to state and federal jurisdiction and offshore infrastructure, and depending on where it is in the water. With offshore drilling, a big focus was around the infrastructure connection to onshore facilities, and so that's where a lot of the bans focused. With offshore wind, there's a lot of permitting happening underway, a lot of rulemaking, and so that's where the complexities around what the federal government can or cannot do right now. And as Alyssa mentioned, there's a lot of questions about how fast some of that would happen, given things that are already in the queue or permits that have already been given or approved, etc. So it varies a little bit depending on the location with the complexities of the federal and state agreements that need to take place. We had a question following up on an earlier question. There's been a lot of action regarding PFAS at the federal level. Do you see this coming to a complete halt, given that it's a fairly bipartisan issue? I'm curious if it will continue to be a priority. I think that's a great question, and one that it's hard to see completely, though I do expect this to continue in the sense that PFAS and forever chemicals at large have become a very popular not popular is not a very good word. They've become a very common conversation topic in the environmental space. And it's really linked to so many things that we think about, whether it's linked to groundwater and wells, if it's linked to farming and agriculture, all these different areas of drinking water that PFAS can contaminate, firefighting foam, etc. And so I do expect that the momentum will continue because of the really extensive and profound impacts of PFAS and the additional science that is really backing that up and putting that into the spotlight. So it's hard to say for sure, but I think the attention will definitely continue at the state level. And referring back to microbeads, the example I shared earlier, we see the opportunity where additional state effort can really help motivate or push for federal action. And I see we had a question on 30 by 30, but I think, Kate, you addressed that already, correct? Okay, perfect. And with that, I'm not seeing any more questions, and I know we're getting toward the end of our time here. But as folks have a chance, if there's any last minute questions, I encourage you to put them in there. The team has done an incredible job of putting resources in here for you all to keep track of and to follow up on all these different topics and conversation pieces we've had today. To close us out, I want to just talk about a few things. First is that we have our full election analysis report is going online. So that will highlight a lot of the trends we talked about here. That will also have information on the ballot measures and links and everything else that you need to have a short but comprehensive review of what happened with the election. We encourage you to sign up for our newsletter to stay abreast of different events that we have throughout the year, learn about new resources we've produced and so forth. And moving forward, we encourage you to check our website. We'll track more than 2,000 bills every year. So you can go to our bill tracking map. You can see what is trending in different states. And that is a priority as soon as sessions start up. So we hope you will stay connected and reach out to myself or anyone on the team with questions. With that, I just want to close by thanking everyone for being here, thanking the team for doing all this incredible work, and for all of you for being leaders in the environmental space. This work will continue. We are going to focus on building the bench of newly elected officials, supporting champions across the country, and we look forward to working with everyone on this call as we work towards that mission. So thank you so much. Please go to our website, follow up with questions, and I hope you have an incredible rest of your day.